Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Paul Russell. He is professor of philosophy at Lund University. He also serves as director of the Lund/Gothenburg Responsibility Project there. Dr. Russell's interests cover the areas of free will and moral responsibility, along with various topics in early modern philosophy. And today we're going to focus mostly on issues regarding free will and moral responsibility. So, Dr. Russell, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Ricardo. Lovely to be here. Nice to join you.
Great. So, sometimes I like to start with the basics. So, in this case, what is free will? Because if I understand it correctly, different people, different scholars from different fields. I will try to avoid what the scientists say, because here philosophical approaches to free will. But even within philosophy, as far as I understand it, it's not that there's a consensus on what free will is, and there are many different approaches to what it is, what it means, and if it exists or not. So, in your view, what is free will, and how should we approach it philosophically?
Well, what you say is exactly right. There is absolutely no consensus. So even as it were, what the problem is, if there's a problem of free will, this is a huge area. And, one of the things that makes it really, as I'm sure you know, really interesting, but almost hard to manage, even just to give a clear idea of what the issue is supposed to be, is that it immediately, as your own sort of remarks suggested at the beginning, it sort of reaches out to other topics that are themselves problematic, like how does it connect with responsibility? How does it connect with morality? How does it connect with agency and mind, blah, theology, all that. And that makes it sort of, there's a feeling that when you start to approach it, you can almost start feeling like you're philosophically or intellectually free-falling through this quagmire of problems. But if this helps, Ricardo, for your listeners and your audience, I think we all have, we're interested in freedom and the idea of being agents of some sort. So there's some connections between being free and having free will and being an agent. And then the question is, well, what does that come to? And that connects it with another notion of the idea that in some sense, we want to be in control of our lives. So to be an agent in some very rudimentary sense is just this, it's even got a subjective side to it, is the experience of being free, the experience of being in control, of acting voluntarily, of understanding what you're doing and guiding your life. And again, just to kind of emphasize the messiness of this, immediately the worry about that is that in some sense we worry that we're not really free or truly free, or we're subject to fate, or we're subject to luck, or there's something going on there that shows that in some sense we're not really or truly in control. So this brings us back to the question of, well, what kind of control are we talking about, where we want to be agents who are controlling our lives, who are in this sense of free, in the real having real free will. And again, you can see what happens is, in some ways you can sort of deflate the anxiety there's a kind of common sense approach of, of course we all know we're free. We all do stuff, we act we know the difference between doing something freely and not doing something freely. And roughly I think the idea there is that it connects the notion of being a voluntary agent. We have preferences and desires, we have things we want to do or don't want to do, and in a very simple way, and this kind of goes to what sometimes seems a kind of compatibilist conception of freedom, but we don't even have to go there right now. It's just the idea that to be free is free action. I'm acting freely when I'm doing what I want to do or doing what I please. So I'm not tied down, not impeded. But immediately, this is where it just gets messy, because that seems like a really simple thing. So like a dog isn't free if it's in chains, but you might say it's free to roam the field. So it's in some sense voluntary. But is it really to have free will? Well, it doesn't really have the kind of control that we think a real free agent has. And it seems like we're thinking of something more demanding and more robust. So then we get into this idea of, well, to be in control, we really need more than just free action, or if you want crude voluntariness, we need something like control of our will, control of the kinds of choices and desires and dispositions that we have. And that's not just acting freely, because you might act freely but not have control of the kinds of choices and desires and dispositions that you've got. So now we start getting into what's the free will problem, because we need something that separates, makes distinctions that seem to matter to us when we talk about free will between animals and humans, between children and adults, and between sane people and insane people.
Right.
These are all distinctions that matter to us. So now we're into the question of what are the sort of, we need some kind of notion of control or freedom that looks more robust, looks deeper than just simple voluntariness. It's got something to do with having control of your own will and your own character. And now the question becomes, okay, what does that mean? And I'm anticipating maybe where we'll go later on in the discussion, but you can see that now the worry is that we're kind of, when we talk about free will, we're looking for something that falls within that range. We start off with a very simple notion, if you want a common sense, crude notion, but we need to refine it. If you want, we need to deepen it, make it more sophisticated. It starts to connect with our conception of ourselves as moral agents. But now we're into a worry that we're making demands about the kinds of freedoms and powers we've got that look like they're, if I can put it philosophically, metaphysically very ambitious, that we self-create somehow, that I'm the person who makes my will or gives my will to myself in some very strong sense. And then you get into, in the history of the subject, just as in terms of free will, conceptions of free will, conceptions of the kind of freedom required for our self-image as moral agents, tied up with rationality. And the rationality is supposed to give you a power of self-control that has, if I can put it this way, a problematic relationship with our sense of ourselves as part of the natural world. So we're kind of into the problem of freedom through that, and then into the kind of free will problem. And then that, yeah, so if that gets us going, Ricardo, that's how I would set it up that way.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, of course, you've already mentioned some of that there, but for free will to exist, and this is now getting specifically into the discussion surrounding its existence, because there are people who argue it exists, there are others who argue it doesn't, and they use many different sorts of arguments and even sources of evidence here. But in your opinion, what conditions would have to be set in place for free will to really exist?
Well, now we're into the really major problems. So again, there's almost nothing that's easy and bite-sized here, but I'll try and do my best with this, because what you say is exactly right. So what we want, you can see how you can set it up in terms of what I just said, that it seems like we want something a little bit more than mere voluntariness, because it looks like there are agents. So now your question comes back, so what are these conditions, these extra additional conditions? And there are a lot of different ways of kind of approaching how we understand this, but again, you can start off with a kind of common sense ideas, that we start off with the notion that we're dealing with agents who in some sense we might regard as acting voluntarily and seem to satisfy standards of ethical life. Let's just start from that point of view. If you want, normal adults. So we have a kind of framework. This kind of approach I'm giving you goes all the way back to people like Aristotle, a notion of kind of excuses and exemptions, these conditions for free will. So one way into this is to draw a fundamental distinction between a theory of excuses, narrowly conceived, where I'm dealing with another adult who I regard as totally a moral agent, acting voluntarily, but there might be circumstances in which I think, but you're not fully or entirely or even at all responsible for what you're doing under certain circumstances, these conditions. These are ordinary, if you want, mundane excuses. So you might, for example, be ignorant of what you were doing. You didn't realize that in flicking the switch, you were setting fire to the house or something like that. Or you did something accidentally or inadvertently, or your action wasn't voluntary at all. So your conduct and behavior might, in this sense, have unfortunate consequences. It might harm other people. You know, a standard example is I step on your foot. If I do that because I'm irritated with something you said, or you step on my foot because you don't like the answers I'm giving, I might think, oh, what are you doing? Because there's a kind of intent, or if you want, a harmful quality of will there, or a harmful disposition, hurtful disposition, and that will, as it were, make me think, well, I'm responding to that. But if I think you don't know, it was totally accidental, or you had an epileptic fit, or you didn't realize that was my foot, or whatever, then, as it were, I don't think of you as acting with full free will, or that you're excused. So there's excuses roughly fit into those kinds of categories. I think of ignorance and accidents, inadvertence, or simple involuntariness as the paradigmatic examples. And we kind of distinguish, and the law distinguishes that. It's very important to the law that if whether you did something in full knowledge with full intent, if you want with a guilty mind, mens rea, or whether you did it accidentally or inadvertently. It might be that you're still you're still showing a lack of care, but it's very different from doing it willfully or with intent. So in some very rough sense, excuses map onto our worries about freedom and acting freely and what that's involved. But there's another set of considerations here that's even more fundamental, which is all excuses sort of operate within the realm where I'm dealing with voluntary agents who are otherwise, I can assume, are responsible agents who have powers of control of the relevant kind. But then I might have a set of exemptions where I think, no, it's not just a question of whether the agent was acting accidentally or in ignorance or with some particular excuse, but the agent may not be a kind of free agent at all. They're just not the kind of person or individual who's capable of free, responsible conduct at all. And then the really interesting question becomes, okay, so what sort of capacities or powers are we talking about that's required of these free, responsible agents? And this brings us back, Ricardo, to the earlier points we were making about the distinction between animals and children, and full, if you want, responsible adults. What is it that happens in moral development where people seem to start off, they're acting in very rudimentary, voluntary ways, but they're not really fully responsible. In that sense, they don't satisfy full conditions of free will, responsible agency. What's happening to them such that we start to see them differently? Well, now we get into the very big problem of what is required, what sort of capacities or powers are required. And this is where I think we now kind of segue here. When you ask this question about what are the conditions of free will, it comes right into big questions of the free will problem, because in saying something about what those conditions, what those capacities and abilities are, you will now start to get very different conceptions of what it requires. So one very mundane idea might be agents have to have enough rationality to understand the nature of their actions, to be able to operate properly with an understanding of rules, to see the significance of when they're breaking the rules, and to be able to anticipate the consequences of breaking the rules. And these are ordinary moral common sense things that children, as a parent or a teacher or whatever, you try to educate children to understand. Don't you see you're hurting your little sister, and that's not nice, and if you do that, you get in trouble, and you gradually acquire these powers as we get older, mature powers, and those are the capacities we care about. But again, someone might say, but this is too crude, because when we think about excusing considerations, we might think that it's not enough to just have those simple powers of mundane rationality, because agents might not really they might satisfy those simple conditions, But there's something stronger that's required for true free will or moral agency in particular, and that's a power to control open futures. So you're making real choices, you're having real choices or open alternatives in front of you. And if you don't have that, if there are background conditions for why you are choosing the way you are choosing, why you have the wants and intentions, even if you understand what you're doing, even if you have in that sense rational powers, you're still being, as it were, subject to background conditions, socially conditioned, psychologically conditioned, biological, theological conditions that make you how you are, and so rationality of that more mundane kind isn't enough. Now we get into the free will problem, and this, as I'm sure you know, the traditional modern problem now becomes a problem about free will and determinism, because there's a worry about whether the kind of conditions that are required for free will require moral powers and capacities of agency such that, as it were, it requires metaphysically open alternatives so that you really choose your future and you alone as the agent are the source or the originator of that decision. Some theorists describe this as godlike powers to create yourself, to create your action, and that's a much more, but it really comes out of, if this makes sense, Ricardo, you start off with ordinary intuitions about excuses and exemptions. We seem to be up and running. We don't really have any kinds of anxieties, but once we start trying to articulate how these all work together, we start to get into worries about just how demanding that set of conditions has to be. And now when those conditions are really very demanding, then you start getting skeptical worries that you could never satisfy them.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into the relationship between free will and moral responsibility, because on the one hand, these would seem obvious. I mean, we have to attribute free will to people, to agents, to be able to hold them morally responsible for their actions, and when that extends to the legal system, to be able to punish them legally, or even if it's outside the legal system, punish them in any way if necessary. So, but on the other hand, I think we can also ask why would we need to attribute kind of agent to hold they, whatever, responsible for their own actions and still punish it, or they, because I mean, just thinking about people could think that even if people do not really have free will, they should still get some punishment as a deterrent, or to prevent them, at least as long as they are getting punished from doing wrong again, or perhaps prevent further wrong in the future from them, just as a sort of, let's say from a behaviorist perspective, some sort of conditioning, like sometimes we do with other animals and small children and all of that. I mean, we don't hold them fully morally responsible for their actions, but we still try to punish them in a way if they do something wrong, to condition their behavior. So, I mean, we could still punish people and hold them morally responsible to some extent, even if we didn't attribute free will to them. I mean, does this make sense, what I'm saying, or not?
Yeah, again, you're onto a very big and large kind of, if you want, join in the subject that we've got here. I mean, there are these kind of large blocks. So there's free will, there's responsibility, and then there's the issues of punishment and retribution. Yeah. And they're all connected. And as your remarks suggest, they're all interconnected in a messy way, but different people untangle them in different ways. One thing I agree with, as it were, the force of your question is helpful, because I think one of the important things is to say they're not all the same question.
Right.
All connected, but sometimes people collapse them as if it's all just one question. Very kind of, it's a way of sort of avoiding some of the difficult or more problematic and messy problems we face here. But just to go right back to the first part of your question, or your first comments, I don't think free will and moral responsibility are the same issue. And the reason I think that is, as for the reasons you were just suggesting, that moral responsibility, you might distinguish between the question of agents being responsible and the question of what's involved in us holding them responsible. And those aren't quite the same thing, obviously, but they're intimately related. And it's a really interesting question of actually, are those two related to each other? So you might, as it were, agree about what the conditions are for being responsible, but have a very different understanding of under what conditions is holding, what's involved in holding an agent responsible. So just to go to that, a lot of your remarks about desert, retribution, punishment have a lot to do with once we know an agent is responsible, an appropriate target, let's suppose of blame, then the question becomes how do we respond to them and what's involved in our response. So, and I'm really just tracking your remarks here, Ricardo, but if I can elaborate on them. Quite right that one way of kind of collapsing this is just to saying, well, all I need to know with my dog, there's no big difference between children, dogs, and responsible agents because it's all just a matter of training. So if I can train my dog to come when I say to come, or not to run away or whatever, and I can do that with various kinds of forms of training and manipulation, depending on how much of a brute you are as a dog owner, maybe incentives or punishments. Then you can, as it were, control their behavior. So do they become moral agents? Well, that seems not right. Also with children, there's something missing there, and I think this brings us back into the free will area. Of course, you can train and control and manipulate agents in these ways and improve their behavior and control them. You can control them in that way. But that doesn't make them self-controllers of the kind we think is necessary for them to have free will and to really deserve retributive practices like punishment. So does my dog deserve to be punished? Well, not really. The dog's just a dog that is misbehaving by the standards of control I want. And so I don't think the dog deserves punishment, and I don't really think it's being punished, it's just being trained. So now we come back to, so what's punishment? Well, punishment intuitively on this more robust or demanding notion connects with this idea of desert. And desert means we're right back into this thing, this set of issues we were talking about before, because intuitively what we think is, well, the bill or character, but someone who deserves punishment is a self-controlling agent of a more sophisticated kind, let's suppose a rational agent, who understood what it was doing, understood that it was violating moral rules or ethical requirements, and that's why it deserves it. And then there's the further question that because blame is appropriate, that suggests that they actually deserve or merit harsh treatment of some sort. Now, all of these every one of these steps is problematic and might be contested. So you might just, for example, share the view that, of course, there's a difference between agents that really deserve blame, but it doesn't follow from that they deserve, or that retribution and harsh treatment is simply on that basis alone justified. I'm slightly inclined to this kind of complex view myself, so I take the view that blame involves something much more than simple training and manipulation and control of agents in the way that we do with animals and children. So blame is targeted at agents who have something more toward a more robust free will capacity or moral capacities of a more sophisticated kind, but it doesn't simply follow that from the fact that blame may under those circumstances be entirely justified, that therefore if positive retributivism, harsh treatment, is part of what they actually it becomes a justified way of treating them. So now we're into separate issues of punishment and retribution, blame, desert, and simple, if you want, voluntariness of a more rudimentary kind. And it is true that some people try to get rid of what they see as the worry about blame and desert and punishment and retribution. They will argue is that it comes with such bizarre metaphysical baggage that it starts to collapse And then they go right back to the very simple, crude kind and just say there's really just, when we're talking about freedom, the only thing we really care about is trading people or pragmatically manipulating them in some ways. So these are the fine-grained issues that and it brings out, just to bring full circle back to your original question, so free will really becomes part of the problem of responsibility for understanding what it is to be a responsible agent and what's required. But there's much more involved in issues of responsibility than just that, because we have a whole bag of problems about what kinds of responses are appropriate, what is involved in holding agents responsible, who has the right to hold agents, what conditions are required of legitimate holding of agents, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. We will come back to responsibility toward the end of the interview, but I would like to ask you a different question now. So within the context of the discussion we're having here, what is the challenge of skepticism?
Okay. This is like one of these marathons where you turn the corner and you realize you've got another.
Yeah.
But they're all, and as you know, you can see that they're all interconnected, because in some sense we've been on the periphery of this question all the way through. And again, I would say here, Ricardo, that skepticism really comes out of this. We ask ourselves, okay, so what is it to be a free agent? We start to try to articulate that and give an account of that. There are certain distinctions that matter a great deal to us. The distinction between being a child and an adult, the distinction between an animal and a human. So we're looking for something that, it's a very interesting question, because it's partly descriptive, but it's also normative. So the descriptive part is, if you want, we look and see what we're actually like, if you want, inside our practices, and we try to articulate them and describe what we're doing. The normative part is we don't want to just say, well, our practices must all be okay, maybe they're okay, because when we start reflecting on the practices that we're describing, we start to ask ourselves, well, are our assumptions about ourselves completely accurate and correct? So now when we start, as it were, we start with the description, we then get into the critical normative stance, is what we believe about ourselves. Does it make sense? Is it truthful about our predicament? Then we might start to get into skeptical doubts, like, no, we've got certain kinds of misconceptions about what we think we're like and what we think is actually required for free, responsible conduct. So the skeptical problem sort of confront us, as it were, on reflection, even from within when we're operating with ordinary life, but we start reflecting on it critically, and then it starts to not make sense to us, or it looks internally incoherent. There might be a kind of larger skeptical problem where we think we step outside the whole framework and we ask ourselves, is the whole framework somehow lacking any kind of intelligible foundation? And if you want, that's a kind of global problem of a separate kind. But I think the kind that's really interesting is the one that sort of arises from simple critical reflection, internal reflection. So if this, again, concrete examples probably help here. So I think of something as old, this goes right back. It's particularly, I think, Western culture that is prone to this, possibly, because there are interesting cultural variations. But you go back to something like the Oedipus story of the great ancient tragedies. So the worry there was the Greeks believed in the gods, and they actually believed that the gods were in control of us. So the worry about Oedipus is just a very kind of, the simple story of Oedipus seems to be acting voluntarily, seems like a normal adult agent, has rational power, seems to satisfy what you're asking about, the ordinary mundane conditions. No ordinary excusing considerations seemed to apply to Oedipus. He knew what he was doing, murdered the man, and married the woman. It turned out but there was some question of ignorance there about excusing considerations. But the more fundamental worry is that the gods were actually in control of the whole scenario of circumstances, so that in some sense it looks like, was Oedipus really in any sense acting morally at all, when the gods have manipulated and controlled the circumstances he was acting in, his own character, the conditions in which he was in, and what sort of choices he was presented with. And in a way, this seems like a crazy kind of bizarre story, but it actually cuts very deep skeptical problem. If I could do this, it goes all the way through, because in Christianity, it resonates with Christianity, with the worry about how do we square the thought that there is a God who created this world, who predetermines everything, who has foreknowledge of everything, and yet we're supposed to be free agents making real choices for ourselves. But it's to put it slightly crudely, it's a cosmic fix. God fixes it, what we're going to do, who we are, what we do, and then holds us responsible when we do wrong and punishes us. How is that fair? That's a kind of deep theological worry, and the Christian tradition has struggled with that all the way through, how to make sense of those sets of assumptions. But if I can just push it on through, it comes right up to the modern version of it, which is, even if you don't have the theological view and the worry about God and a controlling agent who's manipulating us and controlling our circumstances and our character, the kinds of choices we make, and you don't worry that that erodes our free will, you might still worry that nature, let's call it blind background conditions, no God or manipulating agent in the background, but just blind nature, genetics, biology, social circumstances, things that I don't control, will control and determine the kind of person I am and the particular kinds of choices I make and choices I face, and also even the kinds of consequences that those choices may have in ways that I don't control at all. But all of those conditions, this is really a problem of moral luck, I'm kind of articulating informally, is the idea there is, I look like I'm in control, but in fact, I'm going to be morally evaluated for all kinds of due to all kinds of factors, contingent factors, that I have no control over at all. And one version of that might be a kind of determinism worry. So now we're into this kind of deep skeptical problem that when you try to explain what it is, when you say you want something more to free will than just this very crude agency, voluntariness, and you try to articulate it, and maybe I'll kind of a little bit, we were talking before the program started a little bit informally about Nietzsche. This is kind of a worry about a particular conception of morality, that we have a particular self-image that all kinds of things affect our lives in terms of what abilities we have or don't have, what virtues or qualities we have or don't have. But we like to think that insofar as we're engaged in moral life, we're not subject to fate and luck. But in this case, the worry really becomes that no matter how robust this natural account you may give of our moral capacities, we're still ultimately, on critical reflection, just subject to fate and luck. And that starts to erode our confidence that there's really any real moral agency there at all. And then you're into a very deep kind of skeptic funk. And in some sense, the free will problem really operates around that. But it can be given it is given very technical, formal, obviously in contemporary philosophy, but in some sense it's a very ordinary worry that people have of, do people who grow up in terrible social conditions, our jails are full of people who have grown up in damaged families, damaged environment, poverty, and so on and so forth. Are they fully responsible? It's just a kind of skeptical and then the worry becomes, maybe that's true of us all. We're all lucky or unlucky, but there's just luck operating there. There's no real moral agency or free will.
So another question, please tell me in what ways this connects to the kinds of issues we're exploring here. But what are moral sentiments?
Okay, they are. So this, to go back to where we were earlier, we were talking about the distinction between being responsible and holding responsible. Mm-hmm. So one way into this is to sort of understand that when we're talking about responsibility, we can see it from these two perspectives. We can see it from the agent's perspective, if you want, the subject who's going to be held responsible. What is it to be responsible? And that's one way into the problem of free will. But there's also the question is where you can understand it, or one way of even trying to answer that question is by stepping away from the agent's perspective and looking at, if I can put it this way, the spectator's perspective and what it is we're looking for when we hold an agent responsible. And this is where the moral sentiments might come in, and they come in the history of philosophy. So part of this, you could answer this in some ways, historically speaking. Philosophers who I'm very interested in particular, David Hume, try to understand responsibility. You can't just understand responsibility simply from the point of view of understanding being responsible or responsible agency. You have to understand how it relates to, if you want, the social context, the emotional context of our responses to one another. So responsibility involves, as it were, the relationship between agents and those who are holding them responsible, and a crucial aspect of that on this analysis are the moral sentiments, which are, in a kind of more modern language, are emotional responses to the moral qualities we perceive in other agents. So those, in the way that I might respond with fear or love or all these other emotions to certain kinds of objects, I, as a subject, respond to them because I perceive them in a certain way, and on the basis of those perceptions, I evaluate them. I see them as having qualities that I either find attractive or I find dangerous or threatening or whatever. I then evaluate them, and they engage my emotional responses, if you want, they affect me. So the idea here is, in the old problems, it was very much just connected with an idea of, sometimes called the feeling theory of emotion, that to have a moral sentiment was just to have a kind of feeling. So if I saw, say, an agent assault somebody, I would look at that agent and think that's a harmful, unpleasant moral quality or disposition. And that moral disposition, by a kind of psychological association, would trigger a negative feeling in me directed towards that agent, and that would be a felt unpleasant feeling directed or occasioned by and directed back to that agent. But a slightly more sophisticated way now, I think, in terms of philosophy of mind, a more sophisticated theory of emotion, would see the emotion as having, in slightly philosophical jargon, propositional attitudes involved, beliefs, cognitive states. So what's actually going on, and it's implicit, I think, in the traditional accounts with Hume and Adam Smith and other people, is you have to have beliefs of the relevant kind, of a certain range. So to be in that emotional state, you have to have beliefs about the roughly the moral qualities of objects of a certain kind, agents who have certain kinds of moral capacities and powers. So it's directed at an object, and it's grounded in beliefs about them, which may or may not be true. So you can have some rational assessment of the moral set of or claims. And those beliefs, as it were, engage with the normative standards that show what we value or don't value. And those normative standards themselves actually can affect us in various ways. Feelings, physical feeling, physical affect and physiological affect and psychological feelings. And also they are connected, this is all just really implicit in Hume, they're connected with our motivations and our actions. So when I have certain kinds of feelings, in the case of fear, for example, if I see something as dangerous and threatening, it affects me in certain ways, that gives me certain kinds of motivational propensities. And this goes right back to your question about retribution. I'm inclined to treat the object in certain ways. If it's danger, I'm inclined to get away from the object. But if it's something like blame, it looks like it's connected with these negative emotional responses, unpleasant feelings, physiological changes of various sorts. This happens with, say, anger and things of that sort. There's a psychological description to go on here. And motivational propensities to treat the object in particularly hostile or aggressive ways, which then becomes an ethical issue itself, how I handle my moral sense. So as we all know, part of the weird paradox here is that part of moral life is when we're responding to other moral agents, it becomes an ethical issue how we respond to them itself. So as it were, it mirrors one. And just to mention, that's one, that it becomes an ethical issue itself how we emotionally respond to other agents who we hold responsible. And related to that, another interesting question is whether or not an agent can be responsible if they lack all capacity to hold themselves and others responsible. So one view I have, for what it's worth, is that in order to be a responsible agent, you have to be capable of having moral sentiments and understanding and interpreting them. So it's not just rationality, it's having moral sentiments. It's a kind of emotional capacity that is fully integrated with your rational capacities and your motivational dispositions.
Mm-hmm. But when it comes to questions regarding blameworthiness and punishment and basically how we treat people who do bad things, to put it in simple terms, does the fact that we take into account the existence of moral sentiments and different kinds of reactive attitudes or impulsive attitudes that people might have in particular contexts and circumstances, what kinds of implications does it have for the way we decide to blame them or punish them or retribute their behavior in whatever kind of way? Because, you might understand that what I'm trying to arrive at here is the idea that perhaps if we have these positions that might be more or less under our control, then there are at least certain kinds of circumstances where perhaps we wouldn't hold people as responsible as in other circumstances where they perhaps have more self-control, let's say.
Yeah, I think I've got you right. I think this is a really interesting question. I think it's one of the big questions that arises in this kind of horizon of problems that we've got here, because it goes right back, from my point of view, it goes right back to an interesting debate between Adam Smith and David Hume, who were both moral sentiment theorists. So Hume had the idea, if I understand Hume properly, or my way I read Hume, that you have these these moral sentiments, or what now people like P.F. Strawson, contemporary philosopher, would call reactive attitudes. And that this is part of our psychological makeup in the way that other basic emotions are part of it. So you would have to be a kind of inhuman person not to have reactive attitudes of any kind under any circumstances. You can make it as that if someone hurts my child, for example, as a parent, you are bound to react negatively to the person if you think they're intentionally hurting your child. You're going to have very intense, strong reactive attitudes. Why? Because you care about your child, and part of loving your child is seeing that someone should treat that child with some due level of concern and care. And so when they don't do that, you respond. It's reactive value. You respond to them that way. But then it brings on to this question that you raised, because for Hume, as it were, just as you were saying, we have control over our beliefs. So we have to be under rational control about our beliefs, what we think happened, what we understand happened. And I can criticize someone by saying, oh, that person didn't hurt your child, or that person didn't mean to hurt your child, and all these kinds of rational control. So there's rational control over our moral sentiments. But once we arrive at a certain point where we think, oh no, we're agreed that there was, as it were, justified blame here, let's make it, just to ramp up the kind of issue of a very significant kind, it seems to connect with the idea that, as it were, I might not have control over how angry or upset I get. To put it, I'm hardwired to have retributive dispositions. And this is something that you see in human beings, where people get angry and upset, and the public gets angry and demands justice. And the justice often involves harsh treatment, because that's seen as required for fairness as a response. And someone like Smith tends to see, as it were, our retributive responses as just as hardwired as our reactive attitudes themselves. Whereas Hume wants to say, no, our reactive attitudes are going to be, under certain circumstances where they're properly justified, they're going to be triggered, and you can't, as it were, resist them or push them away. This is a kind of what now would be regarded as P.F. Strawson, the well-known late 20th century philosopher, a kind of philosophical naturalism. This is just the kind of beings we are, and we have to be truthful about what our psychological dispositions are like. We have these reactive attitudes, but Hume wants to say, because you don't have, or the Humean tradition wants to say something like, because you have these reactive attitudes doesn't mean you don't have any control over how you respond to them. In the way that, by analogy, and it's kind of interesting, how much control do we have and what kinds of ethical constraints are we operating with? So if I'm afraid, for example, I'm a soldier in a war, you would be a crazy human being not to be afraid in some circumstances if you're being shelled or shot at, and you're going to feel fear. There are many different ways of trying to control that. You might not want to think about the danger, so you just put it out of your mind. You might want to think about the danger, but you want to only make sure that you don't exaggerate it or amplify it or distort it. But now a separate question becomes, supposing the danger is there, the emotional response is justified, there's a real question about how much control do you have in showing your fear. So one of the things you train a soldier to do is to control their fear. They're going to be afraid. But there's a question about, you can't just run away, not if you're a good soldier. So you have to, and there's a kind of parallel, if this is helpful, there's a kind of parallel with retribution, I think, which is, of course, you want to be realistic and honest about blame and our reactive attitudes, but it doesn't follow from the fact that our reactive attitudes, contrary to the skeptic, that our reactive attitudes may be justified, that our retributive dispositions of a strongly hostile kind are justified. And this sort of brings us full circle back to your much earlier set of remarks. That's why you might want to say that retribution and punishment have to be constrained by consequential or utilitarian considerations of a much stronger sort, because it's unethical to simply be imposing, as it were, evil back to evil just for its own sake. That's pointless. But it's an interesting question as to whether or not that is psychologically credible or not. Mm-hmm. And that's the interface, and it's what I find this area is very interesting. It's the interface between having a realistic descriptive psychology and but not abandoning a critical normative framework in which you kind of ask yourself, how much can we keep, or how much do we have to get rid of?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, as a last question / comment, there's something you said there, or at least alluded to, that I think is also very interesting in the context of this discussion. That is, we also have to take into consideration that even when people do wrong and we want to punish them or retribute their actions in some sort of way, in a way that we seem fit, we are also usually under the influence, let's say, of our moral sentiments. I mean, because if we didn't have that sort of psychological predisposition to emotionally react in particular ways to people doing wrong, then we probably wouldn't want to punish them or retribute their behavior in any way.
Yes. And that's exactly right, and it's again a really interesting question that you might say that part of showing that you value and care about certain things, like people's moral qualities, is having these emotional responses. So, if I'm not turning your program into a political program where you become targeted of things, but say I'm looking at Putin on TV when I'm watching the news, and I'm watching the terrible things. To my mind, the completely meaningless, crazy things that are going on in the Ukraine right now. And I'm thinking, what is this character up to? So I find myself, just as a kind of piece of internal psychology, I have this kind of understanding of, my reactive attitudes, I think, are justified. We're not dealing with a crazy person here. We're dealing with the moral agent who understands what he's doing. And I'm thinking, why is this person behaving and making these choices, these horrible choices of this sort? But I can feel maybe you share this, I can feel my retributive dispositions of sort of like, you want to think there's nothing good enough for this guy, he deserves something really bad. But then I also think, so that's just that's not very helpful, it really doesn't help at all. So it's precisely that boundary where you have to, as it were, the worry is that you so become, if I can put, emotionally cold. The law, for example, rightly doesn't want intense emotions running riot over people's judgments, both about whether people are responsible and what, if they are responsible, how we should treat them. Because then you're going to be, as it were, a hostage to your own kind of emotional intensity. And there are real worries about the role of victim impact statements, for example, because you want the victim to be able to be there, or the victim's family to be there, to make clear what the harm or the injury was, what the significance of the action, the conduct was. But you also don't want the society to be responding in ways that show that people are completely out of control because they're understandably so angry at what's happened. So I think both, even in the legal system, we deal with these kind of internal tensions between how do we control it, what kinds of control do we want, and do we want the control to be such that, as you were saying, we don't want it to come back and snuff out the very fact that we value and care about these traits and these conditions as well.
Mm-hmm. And also because we have to take into account, and this is something that has not been observed just by some philosophers, but also by anthropologists, for example, that many times people justify bad behavior on moral grounds. I mean, they are morally motivated because they even sometimes use words or expression like, I'm doing justice with my own hands, something like that. So,
absolutely. I mean, I think that's such an important point, that it's one of the kind of strange paradoxes of the human condition, that some of the worst things we do from an ethical point of view, as you say, are from the point of view of moral motivation, or people who claim to be morally motivated. And maybe who really are sincerely morally motivated, but they do unspeakably bad things as a result of that. And that goes very deep to the problem of responsibility, actually, because that is really at the heart of some of the dilemmas that we face.
Right. Okay, so Dr. Russell, let's end the interview on that note then. Where can people find you and your work on the internet?
So if people are interested, I think if they can Google me, and let's see if I can find I've got a web page, and I'll give you that if I can quickly. It's if people are interested, it's at I've got a Google site, so it's at google.com/site/Paul Russell UBC, and I think you'll get it that way. It will certainly show up in any Google search there, or just Google search Paul Russell, Lund University, and I think it will, or Paul Russell philosophy even. There are a number of Paul Russells, so I have to be separated out.
Great, so I will be leaving...
Find out more.
Yeah, so I will be leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Russell, thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for inviting me.